Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg Raymond. I'm a lecturer at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the ANU, and I'm convener of the Global China Research Spoke at the Australian Centre for China in the World. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this meeting takes place on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to those traditional owners past, present and emerging. This is the first in a seminar series sponsored and supported by the China in the World Global China Research Spoke. The Global China Research Spoke was established last year as a new cluster aiming to increase the quality of research on China's global impact, particularly at societal and economic levels, but also political and strategic at times, to give us a more granular, evidence-grounded picture of how China's impact is changing the countries in Southeast Asia, the Pacific and elsewhere. So our aim is to give researchers opportunities to communicate their research on these topics. So it's my great pleasure today to have a great panel looking at the topic of the myth of non-interference, Chinese foreign policy in Cambodia. And we've got a great panel to take on this topic. So I'm going to hand over to our moderator, Dr. Katrin Travouillon. And let me introduce Katrin. She's a rising star. She's a lecturer at the Department of Political and Social Change here at the Coral Bell School of the Asia Pacific, where I work as well. And her research centres on the discursive and affective dimensions of political change in Cambodia, particularly after the UN Transitional Authority. And she's particularly interested in how the liberal peacebuilding project has shaped political ideas, identities and interactions between domestic and international actors. Since 2019, Katrin has been a member of the editorial team of the Journal of Intervention and Statebuilding. This is a publication committed to critical analysis of international interventions. She's looking there at interactions and practices that influence and transform states and societies. And Katrin's work has appeared in Contemporary Southeast Asia, Peacebuilding and the Review of International Studies, among others. So it's my great pleasure to hand over to you, Katrin, for you to introduce the rest of the panel. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Greg, and welcome everyone. As always, it's really lovely to have these events and see familiar names pop up on the screen. It's great that all of you joined us here for our discussion today. So as Greg already said, the panel title is The Myth of Non-Interference, Chinese Foreign Policy in Cambodia. And the two panelists that we welcome today have published a paper under the same title just recently in Asian Studies Review. I assume that most of you have already read it. For those of you who have not, I encourage you to go to the homepage and download it after our discussion today. So let me just briefly introduce you to our two panelists. It's Suvinder Poh and Kieran Sims. Most of you will already know them. Suvinder is a PhD candidate in international relations at Griffith University, but he's also a senior researcher or research fellow at the Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace. And Kieran Sims is a lecturer at James Cook University. So both of our panelists today have conducted really extensive research in the Mekong region, in particular in Laos and in Cambodia, which will be the subject of today's discussions. If you look at their publication list, you will find commentary, analysis on various aspects of the region's political and economic development. So the panel today is really dedicated to discussing the recent article and some of the author's key arguments and insights, all of which pertain to Chinese influence and interest in Cambodia, which is really a hot button topic, as they say, for quite a while now. So before we move on to the discussion, I just wanted to give you a very brief overview on today's seminar. So what have we planned for today? First, I will hand over to both our panelists to give a approximately 10-minute statement each, just to give you a better appreciation of their research, the research they have conducted, the arguments and insights they have formulated. And that will then form the basis for a brief roundtable that I will conduct with them. What I really want to do is just to discuss with our panelists how these arguments and insights they have formulated, what kind of arguments we can draw from there, or the implications of it for regional, but also for domestic politics in Cambodia. During the final half hour, I really want to give all of you a chance to join the discussion. So while we talk, while you listen to the statements of our panelists, I really want to encourage you to note down any questions you may have, so that we have really a solid half hour to get everyone involved. So with that, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Sovinda Po. Please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank a lot for the very kind introduction, Katrin, and thank a lot, Greg, for the invitation to speak at this prestigious global research, global China research seminar series. So this talk actually mainly based on the article my co-author Kieran, as you can see on the screen, and I published with the Asian Studies Review. As Katrin already mentioned, the title is exactly the same. The myths of non-interference, Chinese foreign policy in Cambodia. For the structure of this talk, I will speak mostly on the empirical aspect of the paper, whereas Kieran would touch on the conceptual part that focuses on the reconceptualization of the term interference. For my part, I will talk about the Chinese support for Cambodia, and then the Chinese interest in doing so since 1997. So in order to illustrate the Chinese support for Cambodia, I'd like to draw your attention to the two most important events. The first event is the July 1997, which is way back. So almost, I guess, almost 20 years ago. So the July 1997, there was a military coup that was staged by the current Prime Minister of Cambodia against his opponent, who was Norodom Ranariddh at that time. So a little bit of background to that context. After the Paris Peace Agreement in 1991, Cambodia organized the general election in 1993 under the leadership of the United Nations. So the result was that the Hun Sen party, which was the main opposition party at that time, won the majority of seats, while the Cambodian People's Party, in short CPP, did not win the majority of seats. However, there was a rejection of the election result. The Prime Minister Hun Sen demanded that the power be shared with him. So at that time in 1993, we saw a power arrangement, what we call co-premiership. We have two prime ministers at that time. Fast forward 4 years later, in July 1997, there was a coup staged by the Prime Minister Hun Sen against his opponent. What was really interesting was the responses from the Western countries, the US, Australia, Germany, and Japan, and a few other international institutions like the World Bank. These actors halted their aid programs to Cambodia as a response to the coup d'etat. It was actually quite significant because Cambodia at that time, after the civil war, the country really needed a lot of foreign aids to run the country. Half of the national budget were actually funded by foreign aid. So the temporary halt of aid provision meant that some government institution could not function. So that was really a big problem for Cambodia at that time. For China, after the coup, China stepped in and provided quite significant support to the Prime Minister Hun Sen. First, China acknowledged the new power arrangement between the Prime Minister Hun Sen and the other Phun Sen member, who was the co-premier. And second, China provided quite a lot of military support as well. And the third one, China also cancelled Cambodian debt that Cambodia took from China since 1960s. This was the first event. The second event is the aftermath of the 2013 election. And that after the 2013 election, there were various incidents that happened in the country. The dissolution of the main opposition party, also known as the Cambodian National Rescue Party, the arrest of the second main opposition leader, Kum Sokha, and then the close down of various media outlets like the Cambodia Daily, and the expelled of National Democratic Institute that was funded by the US. So these were some incidents after the 2013 election in Cambodia. So for Western countries, the EU and the US, they saw it as a some sort of Cambodia return to authoritarianism. So they the EU cut 20% of its everything but arms tariffs for Cambodia, and the US has repeatedly put sanctions on high ranking Cambodian government officials. That was really serious threats to the government. Again, China stepped in and assisted the Cambodian government in this hard time. So in addition to the increased amount of aid, investment and trade, China also provided political support as well. So for instance, in 2017, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang sent a letter to the Cambodian government stating that, quote, the Cambodian People's Party will continue to unite and lead the Cambodian people. China will, as always, support Cambodia in preserving stability, speeding up development, and improving people's livelihood, unquote. So the question is, why is it, what is it for China to do so? So our argument is that China stands to gain both political and economic interest from supporting the Cambodian government. For political interest, Cambodia always supports One China policy, the China's Belt and Road Initiative, and the China's negotiation with ASEAN. So One China policy, current Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen also stated that Taiwan is actually a Chinese province. For the BRI project, Hun Sen, Prime Minister Hun Sen also praised the benefits of the BRI for small developing countries like Cambodia, and also defended the BRI when the project faced criticism such as like the debt trap diplomacy. So it was really not a debt trap diplomacy, according to him. For economic interests, Cambodia wholeheartedly welcomes Chinese investments and trade. For instance, by 2021, which was last year, the combined value of Chinese investment in Cambodia was over $10 billion in a wide range of sectors, including energy, finance, infrastructure, agriculture, telecommunications, and increasingly, of course, real estate. For bilateral trade, in 2020, Cambodia exports to China were roughly $1 billion. whereas China exports to Cambodia were around $7 billion. So in this particular case, we could see China could gain quite significantly from this bilateral trade. With this enhanced economic relations, Cambodia has also supported the internationalization of the Chinese currency, which is the RMB as well. So we could see that China kind of gains quite significant amount of support from Cambodia as well. So with this note, I'd like to stop here and turn it over to Katrin or Kieran. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Savinda, for this overview on Chinese interest in Cambodia. So I will now hand over to Kieran, who wanted to make some remarks on the conceptual framework and arguments of the article.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katrin, and thank you, Savinda. So good afternoon, everyone. As Katrin noted, my name is Dr. Kieran Sims, and I'm based at James Cook University. My research looks predominantly at the politics of development and regionalism within mainland Southeast Asia. And I'd like to also begin today, like Greg, by acknowledging the Gimoi Walabari Yidinji and the Irukandji peoples, who are the traditional owners of the lands from which I join you today, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also to extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians. I'd really like to thank Dr. Gregory Raymond for inviting me to join you today. I'd like to thank Dr. Katrin and Dr. Len Tiarit also for their work involved in making this event happen. And I'd like to thank the ANU, the Australian Centre on China in the World, and the Coral Bell School for hosting, as well as for all of you for joining us today. The article that we've come to talk about on Chinese foreign policy and what we've provocatively called the myth of non-interference is the product of conversations between Savinda and I, which emerged out of a symposium that was held a couple of years back by the Association of Mainland Southeast Asia Scholars, which was hosted by Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. And that symposium had a broader thematic focus around China's growing presence within mainland Southeast Asia. So my research is predominantly focused on Laos, and as Savinda has demonstrated in his opening remarks today, he's very much the expert on Cambodia. And so what I will do is just talk a little bit about some of the conceptual ideas or the argument that we've presented in the paper around interference. And really what we've attempted to argue or demonstrate is that Beijing's support for Hun Sen during moments of heightened political contestation represents a form of low intensity, regime supportive interference. So many of you may have already read the article, or if I'm being a bit ambitious there, then some of you may have already read the article. For those of you that have, you will have seen this term low intensity regime supportive interference used. And that's what I thought I'd talk foremost about today. So what we were trying to do with using the term regime supportive low intensity interference, which is admittedly a bit of a mouthful, is essentially to try and find a more nuanced way to examine how foreign powers and foreign actors have taken sides in Cambodia's domestic politics. So as we discuss in the article, interference by foreign powers is not limited to actions that challenge a regime's leadership, but of course can also include the reinforcement of regimes and the reinforcement of regimes that lack popular support. So in that sense, interference can be both regime supportive or regime contesting. And what we're arguing is that what we're seeing through Beijing's support for Hun Sen during repeated efforts by the Cambodian populace to push for a peaceful transition in political leadership constitutes a form of regime supportive political interference. In terms of intensity, what we were looking for there was a way to differentiate between terms like interference and influence. as we felt that interference is of greater political significance than influence, with influence including routine political and economic exchanges. So the distinctions that we've sought to create between the categories, of course, are not perfect and they're blurred, but we found it useful to differentiate between influence, interference, and intervention. And intervention could have also been an appropriate term for what we were examining if we'd adopted some of the definitions that we cite in the article by Rosenau and Hoffman, for example, who define intervention as changing or preserving the structure of political authority in the target society, or as acts which try to affect not the external activities, but the domestic affairs of a state. So those definitions of intervention are also helpful, but we felt that the term intervention has been frequently used to refer to the use of foreign security forces or other forms of a direct foreign presence on the ground, so to speak. So there was a bit of baggage there that we wanted to differentiate from. And of course, the other reason for choosing low intensity interference over low intensity intervention is that interference speaks much more directly to China's 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and the stated non-interference approach. The last thing that I think is important to mention in terms of how we've sought to define low intensity interference is the importance or the significance of timing. So what we've argued is that when foreign influence is exerted during times of heavy political contestation, during election periods, during the other moments in time that Savinder's explained, and when this influence is intended to support the interests of particular political actors, be it a candidate, party, or otherwise, then it's not in fact influence, but becomes interference. So as we say in the article, when you're distinguishing interference from influence, timing is important. Having sought to define interference in this way, what we've then attempted to do is to show how Beijing supported Hun Sen during these key historical moments discussed by Savinder in ways that have simultaneously supported Hun Sen's grip on power and undermined efforts to push for regime change. So our argument about the myth of interference is in some respects then particular to Cambodia. The same couldn't be said, for example, in terms of Chinese engagement in Laos, because there hasn't been these moments of domestic political contestation. And one of the things that I'm very much interested in hearing, hopefully today, from some of the attendees is whether or not they feel that what we argue has taken place in Cambodia can be also seen in other country contexts. The other point that I wanted to emphasize in discussing China's engagement with Cambodia is that the title of the article being The Myth of Non-Interference is of course a little bit provocative. We're not claiming that principles don't play an important role in Chinese foreign policy. I think it's pretty evident that they do. But what we're claiming is that principles are secondary to core national interest, and that Cambodia shows this. So there's lots of debate around recently, for example, or over the last 2 years or so, around why China hasn't intervened or interfered more significantly in Myanmar. And of course, the reasons for this are complex, and I'm not an expert on China-Myanmar relations, so I don't want to overreach here. But in an attempt to making some sort of comparative reference to our article and the focus on Cambodia, Hun Sen's strong support for Beijing's interests is something that we see as really important for informing China's interference in the domestic politics of the country. And I think it could be argued that neither the NLD or the junta in Myanmar has been as equally supportive of Beijing. So I mention that as an example, perhaps an imperfect example, alongside Laos, as one way to think about both the potential opportunities for, but also the limitations of comparative analyses of what we've suggested is happening or has happened in the past, at least in terms of China-Cambodia relations. And I think, Katrin, maybe that's a good point for me to leave it. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kieran. Yes, after Savinda gave an overview on the history of Chinese interest and influence in Cambodia and Kieran's excellent summary of the article's core arguments, what I want to do now, also for those who may have arrived a little bit later to the discussion, is to move into a brief roundtable of about 25 minutes, just because I would really like to delve into some of the implications that the article and its arguments have on debates that are ongoing about, Cambodia's regional standing, but also the legitimacy of Prime Minister Hun Sen. After after the roundtable, all of you will have an opportunity to ask questions. So please just note them down now, and you can join the discussion afterwards. So one of the elements that I want to start with is concerned, so to say, the most exciting element of each article. That's the definitions. So Kieran already talked about what you exactly, or how you distinguish interference from influence and from intervention. But I want to talk about really the implications that your argument has for regional relations. And in that regard, ASEAN is obviously a very important institution. So you talk about what does or does not constitute interference. And I'd like you to elaborate perhaps a little bit more on how China actually uses this term, or how China defines non-interference, and how exactly that can be distinguished from this principle of non-interference that ASEAN holds so very dear. I don't know who of you would like to take the first question, but you can just unmute yourself.
So Vinda, maybe we could, I don't know, perhaps we could both briefly comment, Katrin, if that's okay. Would you like to start, Savinda, or should I?
You can go first.
Okay, I was hoping you would get me out of trouble. I think, we can say simply China's commitment to non-interference is, as I suspect everybody knows, grounded in these 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and non-interference in international affairs of diplomatic partners is one of those 5 principles. And so historically, I think that came out of China's increasing global diplomatic engagements and, and its efforts to define and position its approach to international diplomacy. I think one of the slight differences with ASEAN is that its commitment to non-interference is grounded more so in the foundation of establishing ASEAN as a regional identity, and a regional entity. So there's some important and really significant commonalities. Respect for sovereignty, for example, is key, I think, to both of the principles of non-interference for China and for ASEAN. But I think that difference between ASEAN states' adoption of non-interference as a key part of efforts to build regional peace and unity is distinct from China's non-interference of policies as focusing more on bilateral engagements. Another difference that I think is not a difference in principle, perhaps, but which is significant in terms of policy, is the relative size and influence of ASEAN states vis-a-vis China. So ASEAN's non-interference policy within the region is between states where the power differentials are reasonably modest, or at least comparatively reasonably modest if you put it in the context of global power imbalances between states. But for China and its engagement with ASEAN, non-interference also plays an important role in its diplomatic efforts to convince smaller powers that it supports the win-win outcomes, that frame Chinese engagements. And I think lastly, perhaps it's important to note that the different states within ASEAN who have all have a commitment to non-interference, interpret or support those principles in different ways as well. So there are differences within ASEAN as well. And maybe I'll hand over to you, Savinda, to add to anything.
I think I fully agree with what Kieran has said. I want to build on a little bit on that concept. If you look at non-interference in ASEAN and in China, we have to really reconceptualize it a little bit further, because the way I see it is that whenever ASEAN or China talk about non-interference, they usually talk about military interference or military intervention. So non-interference here, it means that no foreign military forces in other ASEAN countries. So that should mean, while I call it as a hard form of interference, but if you look at the soft form of it, the political and economic aspect, we kind of see features of interference that are happening on a daily basis between ASEAN and China. So to say that, in practice, to say that states do not interfere, it's not really, in my opinion, it's not really complete.
I see we already have a question. I'm going to ask it in the final half hour. So I've seen it. I'm not ignoring you, but I'm just going to go on with the roundtable for now. So in your article, you also, I think you discuss in great detail how China or how Cambodia benefit from this relationship mutually in terms of, financial or military engagement. However, if we look at ASEAN in particular, there's evidently also quite some fallout that can arise from this relationship, most notably with regard to Cambodia's standing within ASEAN. So I want you to just briefly think back to 2020. At the time, there was the former senior diplomat Bilahari Kausikan, who reflected on China's influence on ASEAN. And he was quite critical towards some of its members, in particular Cambodia and Laos, stating that these members have essentially given up on considering regional interest in their engagement. And he said that, well, ultimately it might come down to cutting the too loose in order to save the aid. So in your opinion, is this something that Prime Minister Hun Sen would consider, or that he would be concerned about? His standing within ASEAN or Cambodia's standing within ASEAN, as a result of his closer relationship to China? What do you
think? Savinda? Please, you go first, Savinda.
Okay. I think that argument is not really practical. It's just one-sided. I guess it's one-sided view. If other ASEAN members decide that Cambodia and Laos should be taken out from ASEAN, that's going to be a big disaster for the region. We have to think about how these two countries contribute to regional peace and stability and economic growth. I believe there are moments that ASEAN members do not see eye to eye, but to suggest that these two countries should be taken out from ASEAN is not really a practical advice. Think about Myanmar. Myanmar now is big. It's another issue. So if you have to take Cambodia and Laos out from ASEAN, you have to take Myanmar out too. So what happens to the ASEAN as a collective regional organization? So that's going to be another disaster for the region and for other major powers as well, Japan, Korea, and China. So yeah, so I for me, I don't think that that's really a practical advice to do so.
If I add to some of Savinda's thoughts, So it's hard to we're only being speculative if we try to suggest what Hun Sen would think about this. But I think certainly we could say more broadly that there must be concern in Cambodia about Cambodia's growing relationship with China and what that means. I'm not a Cambodian expert, as I mentioned, so perhaps Savinda can confirm or deny that, but I suspect that within the Cambodian population widely and within the sort of political systems as well, this would be a persistent question, as I think it is for most ASEAN states, is the relationships that they have with China. But to build on what Savinda was saying, I think that the damage that would be done to ASEAN and to the regional unity and the sort of fragile efforts to create a sense of shared regional identity, and so much work that's been done there, and some notable, really commendable successes that have been achieved. I think the damage that would be done would be too significant by cutting any state loose, as Savinda has pointed out. So I think it would amplify, and it would amplify existing fractures and produce too many tensions. And I also suspect that the former Singaporean senior diplomat was posturing as well in making those comments, right? That it may have not been that he was proposing it as a sort of meaningful way forward, but as a way to critically comment on the concerns that Cambodia's relationship with China does raise for ASEAN around the sort of different issues that people would be familiar with, around South China Sea disputes or other aspects where there's been tensions within ASEAN.
Thank you so much. Also following from both of your comments now, there's obviously the question of perceptions, right? So how is Hun Sen's relationship to China viewed within ASEAN? How is it viewed domestically? What do people think, or who is actually getting what out of this relationship? I just wanted to have a brief look at an argument that Evelyn Goh made in an article. It's from 2014, so I introduced it with a caveat. But at the time, she conducted a study on modes of Chinese influence in the Southeast Asian region. And one of her core arguments at the time was that if we look at relations between China and the Southeast Asian states, what we can see is that China mostly relies on persuasion or on support, so that there is a convergence of interests already. And that really only in a fraction of instances, she observes that China does in fact exert its influence in such a way as to force or coerce a state into something that they wouldn't have otherwise done. If we look at this argument in today's context, in Cambodia, but perhaps also now, if you want to talk about that, do you think that that still holds as an observation, as an argument?
I think China's influence in the region is sometimes, or even potentially often, overstated, and particularly the ways in which China has influence in the region. So I think that Evelyn's right to challenge us to think a bit more critically about that. Of course, we don't have a comparative context where China doesn't exist in the region to compare against the actions of of Southeast Asian states and the way they might behave if China didn't exist. Building on that, China is a leading trade partner, a leading provider of foreign investment, and for many countries, a leading provider of aid, what we could call aid funding, for most countries in the region. So while I think we need to be careful about how we understand and try to explain China's influence, I would suggest it's always present in major decision-making of Southeast Asian states when it comes at least to nationally or transnationally significant political and economic decisions. There's a big difference, I think, between being induced to do something and being coerced into doing something. So if we look at the case of Cambodia, for example, I think Beijing or China has been very successful in inducing its interests in ways such that coercion isn't needed, right? And I'd say that this, and this is something that the article we're here to discuss today also discusses, is in large part due to Hun Sen benefiting so significantly from Beijing's support. So, if we use the language of win-win, perhaps there's a win-win relationship here where coercion is not present and doesn't need to be present, but influence most certainly is.
Sure that Prime Minister Hun Sen would appreciate the win-win analogy. Monuments to this idea. So Vinda, did you want to add something?
I fully agree with Kieran. I just want to add one statement. When we are living next to the dragon, even the dragon is sleeping. Every decision that you make, you have to take that into consideration. That's it.
I mean, Savita, you briefly made this distinction between hard and soft forms of influence or intervention, right? And if we talk about the ways in which China benefits from a close relationship to Cambodia, one of the, I think, topics that has come up for the last 4 years now is the Ream naval base. There have been all kinds of rumors, so anybody who follows Cambodian politics will be very much familiar with that. The basis being that there is construction happening at the naval base in Ream. China has clearly contributed financially to the construction of this naval base. And the question is whether or not this means that China wants to establish a military presence in Cambodia, which, as you also mentioned, Kieran, at the very beginning, would obviously be a huge issue in ASEAN and their interpretation of non-interference. So, as I said, for now we mostly have rumors. Observers are convinced it means that China will establish a military presence. The Cambodian government denies this. What is your take on that debate right now? Do you want to engage your own observation, thoughts, ideas? How likely is it?
Well, I like to give it a go first. I think theoretically there are strong incentives for China to have military bases overseas. So any major power would want to do that. The US has done that for the past several decades. So it's quite strategic, significant for China to have military base overseas. In times of crisis, those overseas military base will be useful for China. However, with that said, there is no or there is less interest for Cambodia to allow that to happen, to be frank. So as much as China wants, I don't think the Cambodian government would want that to happen, because that would jeopardize the regional stability, and they will jeopardize the bilateral relationship, not just between Cambodia and Vietnam, Cambodia and Thailand, but also Cambodian and other regional powers, South Korea and Japan, and even the US as well. So if we can anticipate the loss for the Cambodian government, we would understand that this decision, Cambodian government would not allow that to happen, because it's a big loss for the government, but it would be a big gain for China. So in this particular situation, I'm not so sure that how the situation evolves down the road. So we have to wait. We have to wait and see.
Would that be an example? Let's say there will be an announcement. They admit that there will be military presence. Would that be an example of not persuasion, but slightly more towards coercion? Would you see it that way?
Kieran?
I think if I was asked this question, I would think to myself, I'm going to see what Savinda thinks. So that's the first thing I'll say. I think he's much better placed to answer this question than I am. What I would add to what Savinda has said, I guess, is that I don't know the answer to whether or not a naval base will be established. But if it was, that would be a significant act of aggression by China within the region. So I think it's much bigger than just China and Cambodia in that sense. And I think that needs to be an important part of the considerations around whether China will seek to do this, and if it does, when it will seek to do this and under what context. Because I think, in the context of what it would mean for Cambodia's relationship with ASEAN, obviously we can say generally it's probably not going to be well received by much of ASEAN, but I think that is going to apply equally to other ASEAN states' views of China as much as Cambodia, perhaps even more so, right, in the sense that there may be a view that, well, if the price was right for Cambodia to do this, then they shouldn't have, but there's a way to explain why they would have allowed this naval base to be built. But for China, there's really only one explanation for why you would build a base here, and I don't think the rest of ASEAN would be convinced that it's just about China-US tensions or otherwise.
So far the discussion really has touched upon regional views, international views of China's relationship to Cambodia, the benefits that each of these partners derives from the relationship. But before we go into the broader discussion, I'd really like to understand a little bit better how this relationship plays out from the point of view of the broader population in Cambodia. So probably have to ask Savinda first, if we're slightly more attuned to that at this point in time. One question that I'm interested in concerns the dissolution of the CNRP. You already mentioned that in your opening statement. So for those of you perhaps not quite familiar with Cambodian politics, the opposition party was dissolved by the Supreme Court officially. We could say the government, I guess, ahead of the 2018 elections in Cambodia. And the question is, what do you think was the significance of this move from China's point of view? And then I will ask a question with regard to popular perceptions. So
right, I think that's really interesting question. What we've seen so far before the dissolution of the opposition party, CNLP, this biggest main opposition party was quite hostile towards China. There were strong rhetorics from their leaders regarding the Chinese presence in Cambodia. So we saw that as a political tool for the opposition party to to win the popular support. So I think if we put that into consideration, there will be strong incentives for China to go closer with the ruling party rather than the opposition party, because the rhetorics were actually clear that the opposition party would do something that perhaps against the Chinese interest. One of which was the Taiwan issues. There were some small incidents in the past that the opposition party would somehow move closer to Taiwan. So the Taiwan question is not something that China would tolerate. So China would not tolerate the Taiwan issue. If you touch on this, that will be serious consequences. So this actually happened in the past for other countries as well. Even now in the US, Pelosi wanted to visit Taiwan. There were strong reactions from China, so the trip had to be canceled. So yeah, in that regard, the opposition support for Taiwan could be another factor that the Chinese government moves closer to the ruling party of Cambodia.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, China was among the few who have expressed support for Prime Minister Hun Sen right after his electoral sweep, obviously without the opposition or the largest opposition present. You also mentioned, however, that Sam Rainsy, Kem Sokha, they have engaged in quite virulent anti-Chinese rhetoric ahead of the election, but also now. Can you give us a sense for how successful that rhetoric is? Because, I mean, yes, there is these examples of crime in Sihanoukville that was very much linked to Chinese presence. There's a lot of protests against large-scale, projects on the dams, but there have also been positive examples of Chinese engagement during the pandemic. They've provided vaccines. They were quite helpful in that regard. So what do you think is the impact really of this rhetoric by the opposition and the observations of the broader population where Chinese influence is concerned?
I think it's pretty much like a love and hate relationship. So for most Cambodian people who actually benefit from Chinese investments and trade, they tend to have a favorable views towards China. But for those who kind of affected by Chinese developments, for instance, as you mentioned, the hydropower dams, or some people in the Sihanoukville, they tend not to view China as a good power. So pretty much the view inside Cambodia pretty much divided. It's not a singular view towards China. For most people who benefit from Chinese investments and trade, and of course, as you mentioned, Chinese assistance in health, combating the COVID-19 pandemic, especially the vaccine donations to Cambodia. So a lot of people would appreciate that kind of assistance or gesture, but only a small segment of the population would say no, especially those who were living in areas that were affected by Chinese developments, Chinese investment projects such as hydropower dams and some in Sihanoukville. So yeah, so my answer is that the view is kind of divided within the country.
Before we move into the discussion with the audience, and I've taken note, I've seen that some of you have already submitted questions in the chat box and others have their hands up. I'd like to give you just the opportunity to make like a 1-minute concluding statement, just to reflect on whether you think China's relationship to Cambodia adds to or subtracts from the legitimacy of the Cambodian government. We'll start with Kieran.
Kieran, yeah.
Sure. So I think the question can be asked sort of as we've talked about already, domestically and in the context of ASEAN or the wider region. So I would say that it certainly, the relationship strengthens Hun Sen's grip on power within Cambodia, but I think it raises some challenges for the legitimacy of his leadership, domestically to some extent, but internationally more so. I think that's where the key tension is, and I think this connects to what the conversation you were just having around political opposition within Cambodia, and clearly an effort to try and generate sort of anti-Chinese sentiment as part of their political campaigning and strategy as well, which we even see here in Australia, with the current election attempts to make that part of the election campaign, but also just to remember that the historical examples that we talk about in the article, where we're making this argument for regime supportive low intensity interference, other foreign powers were also engaging in regime contesting low intensity interference at the same time. So that's a sort of got a deep historical roots to that kind of ongoing tension or debate within Cambodian politics too, I think.
Last.
Oh, me? Okay. Well, I think Kieran has said everything I want to say. So, yes, so I think domestically, Chinese contribution to legitimacy of the ruling party of Cambodia is quite significant. We've seen that. So Chinese economic assistance, Chinese aid actually help enhance the popularity of the leadership in the country. Internationally, probably that's not the case. So internationally, most, especially Western countries, do not see that close relationship as something that they want to celebrate. So they see it as a sign of worry. So yeah, so that's kind of a double-edged sword for the Cambodian government as well.
Perfect. So I think we have plenty of material for a discussion. So let me first thank the two panelists.